Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the next Jacobin stay-at-home lecture. We're going to do things a little bit differently today. My name is Paul Prescod. I'm a teacher, member of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, and part of Philly DSA. I will be joined shortly by Mindy Isser, who is also part of Philly DSA and works with the Domestic Workers Alliance. So tonight we'll be talking about the United States Postal Service, why it's so important, what they're trying to do to it and privatize it today, and why it's so important that we fight back. So again, thanks everyone for joining. I hope people are safe and doing well. And so we'll have Mindy talk for a little bit, and then we'll kind of have a broad discussion and do Q&A like normal. And just make sure you hit like and subscribe to Jacobin. We're not asking for any financial contribution right now, just that you hit like and subscribe. So Mindy, I'll let you take it away. Why is the post office so important, and what is happening to it?
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to get to why the post office is so important soon, but first I'm going to give a little history of USPS as we know it. So before 1970, the United States Postal Service, as we know it today, just didn't exist. It was the U.S. Post Office Department, and it was part of the cabinet. And at that time, postal workers unions, although they existed, didn't have the right to collectively bargain. So before 1970, postal workers' lives were pretty dismal. Full-time workers earned only slightly over $6,000 a year to start. And so the annual salary for postal workers was 27% lower than for New York City sanitation workers and less than 50% of police and transport worker salaries. So obviously pretty low. And even veteran workers with decades of experience made less than $8,500 a year. And so obviously many workers qualified for food stamps and other kinds of assistance, and it was really, really difficult to support a family on postal wages. And so postal workers would get sporadic raises, but every raise they got was from basically begging Congress. And postal workers used to joke they didn't have collective bargaining, they had collective begging. And so between 1967 and 1969, they actually got no raise. And fun fact, during that time, Congress raised its own pay almost 50%. And so people were pissed, and besides wages, conditions otherwise were really bad. Postal services were freezing in the winter, sweltering in the summer. And as mail volume increased, so did harassment from management. And now we think of postal jobs as Black jobs, and this was true then. Many of these postal workers were Black, as white workers left for better jobs in the 50s and 60s. And so in 1968, the Capitol Commission, which was a special panel that had been studying postal reform during President Johnson's administration, concluded that postal workers were entitled to the same collective bargaining rights as private sector workers, according to the National Labor Relations Act. Congress chose not to act on these recommendations, and that really backfired on them, which we'll get to soon. And so because of the lack of raises and poor conditions, workers were understandably pissed, and they started acting on it. In 1966, there was a worker slowdown, which caused a breakdown at the Chicago Post Office, which at the time was the world's largest. And in 1969, both the National Association of Letter Carriers and the National Postal Union, which later merged into APWU, which we'll talk about later, passed convention resolutions to explore overturning the no strike law. So things are really happening. Workers are mad, and the union is moving, albeit a little bit slowly. And so in Manhattan and the Bronx, over 5,000 postal workers took part in a demonstration about wages and working conditions on June 20th, 1969. And then a few days later, July 1st of that same year, clerks and carriers in the Bronx in Branch 36 staged a sick-out. The workers who participated in the sick-out were suspended, but then 16 other carriers called in sick. And so this action electrified postal workers, including Vince Sombrado, who we'll talk about later, as he was one of the leaders of the 1970 postal workers strike. And so Sombrado and his union motioned to pay the suspended workers 2/3 of their salary. Every single rank and file worker voted to support the motion, but the leadership voted against it, and it lost. But the workers created a rank and file caucus, and eventually the suspended workers were paid. And this kind of action really foreshadows the postal strike, which was really led entirely by rank and file workers, and frankly, not really supported by the union. So now we're getting into the postal workers strike. The National Association of Letter Carriers president, James Rademacher, I think I'm saying his name right, broke ranks with the other postal unions to make a deal with Nixon for a 5.4% wage increase, which was also tied to a plan to corporatize the post office. And on March 12th, the House Post Office and Civil Service Committee announced this wage increase. And remember, at the same time, Congress had raised its own wages almost 50%. And again, postal workers hadn't seen a raise since 1966. So this really was a straw that broke the camel's back. Postal workers in Manhattan were fired up. And at a meeting on March 17th, over 2,600 workers showed up. And Sombrado, who I mentioned just a moment ago, led the strike vote, which passed by a margin of 500. The workers started picketing shortly after midnight the next day on March 18th. Obviously, the strike was illegal. Strikes against the government are illegal. And so this was actually the first major strike against the government ever and the largest public sector strike ever also. Truly, it was a historic strike in every single way. And the union was obviously ordered to go back to work, with the unions themselves threatened with fines of $100,000 per day looming over their heads. And so the government and frankly, the postal unions as well were really scared and trying their hardest to control the strike and get workers back to work. And just to explain how big of a deal this was, elected officers and officials in the union were literally hiding from subpoenas, and mail carriers who were also veterans, which there are many veteran mail carriers, were told that they would lose their pensions if they didn't go back to work. But the workers stayed strong, and they could have been fined $1,000, been thrown in jail for a year and a day, and of course they could have lost their jobs automatically forever. But it really was just a strike that just erupted because workers were so fed up. There was no time for the union to plan and less time for the government to react, and the union officials really had no way of making their workers go back to work. And just to show you how fired up and serious the workers were, I think we're going to show a quick clip of them being interviewed during the strike.
I don't like to go on strike, but we must because they've been pussyfooting too long.
You can't live in New York City on what they're giving us.
I've been told I'm eligible for welfare, but I don't want to take welfare.
We want to work, but this is the only means we have of letting Congress know that we cannot take it any longer. Either they give us what we should have, or we will stay out on strike until hell freezes over.
And so that was awesome. Obviously, the workers were not fucking around. They were really serious and they were really committed. And that showed. And so within a few days, the striking workers in New York were joined by 200,000 other postal workers around the country. Workers in 13 states, 200 cities and towns, and 671 postal stations across the country participated in the strike. And Nixon addressed the strike on TV. But what that really did was just strengthen the strikers' resolves and honestly help to grow the strike. And like I said, this really was a rank and file driven strike. There was no coordination or central planning by the union. Strikers used personal phone calls, newspaper coverage, face-to-face meetings, and portable radios to get the latest updates from around the country. And the rank and file caucus put together their own platform of demands that included a full government pension, retirement after 20 years, life insurance, area wages, and of course, the right to strike. And so the strike created a complete and total crisis for the entire country, especially in New York City. New York's mail was 98 to 99% shut down, and it was also shut down in other places. People didn't get any of their mail. And so obviously that included paychecks. And so people weren't getting paid and they were pissed. And so there was a lot of urgency around figuring out how to end the strike. And even bigger than that, checks, stock certificates, and bonds couldn't be delivered on Wall Street. And so the stock market fell, and there was a real fear that the stock market would have to close entirely. And it just truly created a crisis for the ruling class. And so Nixon ended up declaring a national emergency and sending in the National Guard to deliver mail, which backfired. So at one point, almost 19,000 members of the National Guard were in New York City, and it really didn't work out well at all. It turns out that sorting and delivering mail is a really difficult and complex job that letter carriers are really good at. And it turned out also that many postal workers were also in the National Guard. And there was real camaraderie and solidarity between the two groups. They were fraternizing for sure, and sometimes they even worked together to sabotage the mail processing, which is true working class solidarity. And at this point, the government and the unions were really scrambling to get workers back to work, because not only were they shutting down the economy and shutting down the mail, they were inspiring other government workers to go out on strike. Members of AFG locals had to be personally talked off the ledge by their national president. And the National Association of Letter Carriers president, James Rademacher, the same person who made the deal with Nixon for the 5% raise, offered the workers another deal. And it was that they would get raises, but only after they came back to work. And so obviously the workers rejected that deal. And so people started to realize that there really was no end in sight. The workers weren't backing down, and instead their strike was just growing larger and getting stronger. And there's a saying in the labor movement, when you're on strike, one day longer, one day stronger. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the opposite is true. People get demoralized. Sometimes people even go back into work. But in this case, it was like each day that went by really just fed their anger and their resolve, and the anger and resolve of other postal workers. And so after 8 days, the strike ended, and obviously the workers won because we have the USPS. Not a single worker was fired or jailed. Employees were granted an overall 14% wage increase and a formal seniority system. And instead of taking 21 years to reach top salary, workers can now reach top salary after 8 years of service. And obviously, most importantly, they won collective bargaining rights. And just to give more context to the strike, all of this was happening either in or coming off a period of extreme unrest and dissent. The movement against the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement. And this era also saw an ongoing wave of rank-and-file rebellions in private and public sector unions across the country. And in New York City, teachers, sanitation workers, and transportation workers had all gone out on illegal strikes right before the postal walkout. So this is all in their backyard. Their neighbors were going on strike. They were seeing it. And they saw people standing up. They saw people winning. And these movements and victories really, really built on each other. And so, like I said, there would be no USPS the way we know it without the 1970 postal strike. And so shortly after the strike was over, the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970 was signed, which created the USPS as a corporation-like independent agency with an official monopoly on mail delivery in this country. And it also gave the 4 major postal unions collective bargaining rights: the American Postal Workers Union, the National Association of Letter Carriers, the National Rural Letter Carriers Association, which my mom is a member of. Hi, Mom, if you're watching. And the National Postal Mail Handlers Union. And so APWU was actually created at this time as a merger of 5 smaller unions, becoming the largest postal workers union in the world. And so for the first 4 contracts, all of these unions bargained together. But in 1981, APWU and the National Association of Letter Carriers, the 2 largest unions, formed their joint bargaining committee, and they just negotiated the 2 of them. And since 1994, all of the postal unions have bargained on their own. And so during bargaining in 1984, this was kind of a pivotal moment because USPS pushed to hire new workers at pay levels about 20% below wages of current employees. And so at that time, postal clerks and letter carriers were paid wages that started at $21,511, and eventually they rose to $24,147. Under the new pay scale, they would start at $17,352 and rise to $20,476. And of course, for the new workers, they also got less vacation and less sick leave. So essentially what that means is if you started work before 1984, you'd be in the first tier, starting at $21,000 and change. But if you started after 1984, you'd be in the second tier, and you'd start at $17,000 and change. And so in other words, if you started after 1984, your highest wage wouldn't even reach the starting wage of those who started before 1984. So just a huge, huge difference. And so at this time, 2-tier pay systems were still relatively rare, but they had become an increasingly popular demand from management, and not just at USPS, but really all around the country. And so now we've seen those 2-tier wage systems all over the place at USPS, but also at UPS and General Motors. Those are 2 good examples, and 2 big contract fights and strikes were over those tiers. And we see this in my mom's union, the National Rural Letter Carriers Association. And we can talk about that a bit more later. And so for USPS at this time in the 80s, when they were bargaining, it was right after the PATCO strike. And if you don't recall, this was when Reagan fired almost 12,000 air traffic controllers for an illegal strike. And so because the political climate was so anti-union and the president showed workers that he was essentially stomped them, unions were in a really weak position. And this was obviously essentially a 180 from the strike in 1970, which was an illegal strike, but the workers won. And another thing that kind of quieted postal workers, besides Patco and Reagan, was that mail processing facilities were increasingly relocated to rural and suburban areas to diffuse the militancy demonstrated in cities by the 1970 strike. And so that kind of brings us to today. In 2006, the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act was passed under George Bush. This act really sucks. It requires the Postal Service to calculate all of its likely pension costs over the next 75 years and then put away enough money to cover most of them. And of course, up until this time, until 2006, the USPS funded those obligations on a pay-as-you-go basis, pulling out of its pension fund and adding to it as retirees' costs came in, which is what every other business and every other state government does. And so the act also required postal services to invest its retiree funds exclusively in government bonds, which are obviously very safe, but they have extremely low returns. They also had to put away an extra $5.6 billion per year, which was an equivalent to imposing a tax of 8% on the Postal Service's revenue. And so obviously this became impossible. The burden became much too great, and the Postal Service began defaulting on their payments in 2012. And so they've reported net losses for 11 years running. And in 2018, Trump created a task force to audit USPS. So things have already been dire. And now, thanks to the COVID pandemic and the crisis, people are using the mail much less frequently. Things are even worse. And USPS will run out of cash by the end of September if they don't get a bailout and they don't get support from Congress. And they've requested $75 billion in funding from Congress to help them stay afloat. So I know that was a lot, but that really takes us to today. And I'm going to pass it back to Paul, who's going to talk a little bit about what the USPS means for good jobs.
Thanks, Mindy. That was great. And I just first want to start by just reinforcing something she mentioned. I mean, to me, the conversation about the financial troubles of the USPS, it really begins and ends with the Postal Accountability Act. I mean, that is the singular reason why they're having financial difficulties. You can't point to any other public or private institution that has to fund pensions 75 years in advance for people who are not even born yet. So that law has to be repealed. And, sure, there's been a drop in mail volume, but that Postal Accountability Act is the heart of this issue. So I really hope people, when you have conversations with people, really bring that up. Most people do not know that the Postal Service is forced to do that. And that really is causing their financial troubles. But I kind of want to highlight more of what Mindy was talking about in terms of what the post office means for Black workers. And though it may not seem like it on its face, I think fighting to save and improve the post office is really one of the most important things we can do to be supporting Black workers right now. There's a phrase, I don't know if many people have seen the movie Hollywood Shuffle. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it, but there's this phrase, there's always work at the post office. And this is kind of like an understood thing in many Black communities. And there's a long history of many famous, prominent Black Americans who have worked at the post office, people like Richard Wright, Charles Mingus, Dick Gregory. Many people know Danny Glover's parents were proud Postal Worker Union activists. So there is kind of a rich history here. And it's fitting that this goes back all the way to the Civil War. So federal employment is opened up for Black people in 1861. And in 1864, there's legislation that bans discrimination in federal employment. And this allows Black workers to get a foothold in a relatively stable employment that has some status attached to it. And I think a great example of this is someone like William Harvey Carney. And I think we have a picture that can go up. It's a great example of this dynamic. So he escapes from slavery in the 1850s, volunteers for the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which is the famous all-Black regiment during the Civil War. After the war, becomes a postal worker in 1869, and he served as a postal employee for 30 years. And he was actually founding vice president of the National Association of Letter Carriers Branch 18, and now, of course, still exists today as one of the postal unions. And these early NALC branches grew out of the Milwaukee local of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a fraternity for Union Army veterans. So a lot of these Black Union Army veterans got postal jobs, and Black postmaster generals during this time were actually seen as sort of like a threat to white supremacy because they had a level of status that many other Black people didn't. And during the early part of the 20th century, Black postal workers were seen in a similar way that Pullman car porters were seen. And Pullman car porters were the union organized by A. Philip Randolph. And they were kind of seen as the stable Black middle class, but also civic leaders. So the Black Postal Worker Union was closely allied with the NAACP and A. Philip Randolph. And they were kind of part of this early civil rights nexus, during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And some of the most important NAACP chapters were led by Black postal workers during this time. And so as federal employment expands in the New Deal, you see postal employment become even more important for Black workers. So to give some examples of this, in 1935, Blacks made up nearly a third of the postal workers of America in New York City, and they made up 12% of all public workers in the city. By 1940, 14% of all Blacks who earned above the national median income worked for the post office, which is a huge percentage for just one industry. And also, Black women specifically found opportunities in the post office and federal employment that they couldn't find elsewhere. I think we have a picture of one of these early Black women postal employees. And I'll quote from a postal union newsletter from 1966 that highlights what's going on here. He says, "It is important to note that most of the women coming into the post office are Negroes, reflecting conditions in the American economy and the unfair treatment that they received on the outside down through the years. These women come into the federal government hoping that they will get a fair shake." And, Black postal workers understand what this means for today. So as there has been cuts in jobs and cuts to the Postal Service, I'll quote the former vice president of one of the early Black postal workers unions when he says, "The Postal Service has long been a place where Negroes who were denied jobs in the private sector could earn a decent living. But with the loss of these jobs, you'll just about break the back of the Black middle class." And let's look at today. Over 20% of Postal Service employees are Black, and the Postal Service still represents living wage employment. The average salary is about $50,000 a year. And I'm not trying to say that if you work at the post office, you're in a worker's utopia, but relative to most jobs under neoliberalism, this is very stable work that is hard to come by in many cities. And even in general, when we talk about federal employment, 1 in 5 Black people work in government jobs. And I think it is an undeniable empirical fact that federal employment has been the greatest factor mitigating Black poverty over the years. To give a statistic for this, the median income of Black men who work full-time in the public sector is roughly 15% higher than those who work full-time in the private sector. And for Black women, it is 19% higher in the public sector. And I think given what's happening around the country and today with the protests around police violence, so I would never say that, saving the Postal Service is going to end racist police violence, but I think a lot of us know that police violence is very intimately tied to many other issues like cuts in public services and cuts in living wage employment. And I think, if the Postal Service is privatized, this is just one more, pillar, like a thin line between, stable living and poverty and desperation for many Black workers. And these kind of cuts really play into what we're seeing with police violence across the country. So before we maybe talk more about today, I was thinking, Mindy, do you want to talk maybe just a little bit about what it's meant for your mom as a employee as a letter carrier?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That was great. So like I mentioned, my mom works for the USPS. She's been there 9 years. She's a rural carrier. And so when she started as a rural carrier associate, which is how you have to start in the post office, as some kind of part-time or temporary job. And so when she started, she was making $18 an hour. Now I think she makes around $25 an hour. And I asked her if there's anything she wanted me to share tonight. And she said she really loves her job. She feels like she's providing an important service to everyone in this country, regardless of where they live. And she feels like she's paid fairly. But she also feels like because of the new multi-tier wage system, she understands why some people wouldn't want to work for USPS. So when she was an RCA, she was an RCA for 6 years. It took her that long to get a full-time job. And so during that time, she only got her wages. She didn't get any health benefits. If she didn't work, she didn't get paid. There's no paid time off, nothing like that. And so now she gets all those things because she's a full rural carrier. And so just to get to your point of how important the post office is for Black workers, my mom is literally the only white worker in her post office, and the post office includes there's 30. The post office has a rural side and a city side, which is really crazy because she says there's at least 3 or 4 unions in her fairly small workplace, and so they have different ways of clocking in. Some wear uniforms, some don't, and it's kind of, they don't bargain together, and we both think that's insane. And so all of the clerks are Black, and on the city side, there's 30 carriers and 3 are white. The rest are Black. And on the rural side, where my mom is, there's about 15 total carriers, and my mom is the only white person. So that really shows that it really is such a boon to the Black middle class. And so, but now, as I said, she started at $18 an hour. But now people who come in her same position that she came in as an RCA, they're only making $13 an hour. And what she shared with me is that the job is so hard. It's so physically demanding. You're on your feet. You're carrying really heavy parcels. And right now you're at risk as an essential worker of getting COVID. And it's not as good of a job as it used to be. And so I think our role as people who care about the USPS is making sure that we are defending it so we can strengthen it.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a dynamic with all public sector where, they defund it and it functions worse, and then, it turns the public against it. And I can attest, I've met Mindy's mom. She's great. So glad we could shout her out here. And also touch on is some people might have heard about, there's the new Postmaster General that's been appointed by Trump. And, a lot of people have been, his name is Louis DeJoy. A lot of people have been focusing on, he's a Trump donor, and he's in charge of fundraising for the RNC in Charlotte. But I want people to pay attention to a deeper dynamic at work here. So he was formerly the head of New Breed Logistics. And this is a logistics contractor that has done a lot of business with the Postal Service. And now think about this, he's now going to be in a position of overseeing decisions that directly relate to his personal financial interests. So he and his wife have between $25 and $50 million in stock in this company that he's now going to be, overseeing the post office, which has contracts with this company. And let's look at, what does this company do? And you can sum it up in one word: automation. And so this company focuses on how to weed out as many workers as possible and replace them with machines. He has a long history of that. And so this is what we can expect to intensify as he is the Postmaster General. And this company also has a long record of anti-union behavior and labor violations. They've racked up all these violations around health and safety, sexual harassment, and wage theft. So, make no mistake, Trump appointed this man to run the post office like it's in the private sector. And so that means attacking the postal unions, cutting jobs, and maximizing profit. And a lot of the media is now, they're trying to boil this down to a petty squabble between Trump and Jeff Bezos. And I think that kind of really misses the point that the administration is already on record that they want to privatize the Postal Service. What the money that the Postal Service is asking for, the administration now wants it attached to strings that would, enable them to privatize it. So I think people should be aware of that when looking at who this new Postmaster General is and the danger that he poses to it. And I'll also say, I know, there's different opinions in the left about the election coming up, but I hope I don't sound like a hysterical MSNBC commentator, but don't get it twisted. I can really see a path where Trump is going to, not allow mail-in voting or use the excuse that the Postal Service has run out of money and basically use that to steal the election or not have an election. Again, I know this sounds like maybe slightly hysterical, but I think this is for your friends who hate Bernie, love Joe Biden, hate Trump. I think this is a way to tell them like this is extremely important, even for like the most basic function of our democracy, given this pandemic, that we have a functional postal service. So I just wanted to also throw that in there. I don't know, Mindy, if you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's totally right. And I think the USPS is really not sexy. And I think you and I have a kind of seemingly odd fascination with it, but it really is important. And it's like the one service that our country provides that is actually for everyone and everyone likes. I mean, USPS has a over 90%, I think, approval rating. Like that's just unheard of for any kind of federal program or anything. I mean, everyone's usually always talking about bureaucracy and how slow things are. You can go to the post office and send a letter across the country to California for 55 cents. I mean, I think that's crazy. And it gets there in 2 or 3 days. I mean, anytime I think about that, I'm just amazed. And I think a lot of people, sorry, I'm laughing at the live comments. Some of them are really ridiculous. Hi, Mom. She says she loves her fan club. But yeah, I think like we really take for granted that USPS is so affordable and so fast and also such a good job provider. And like you said, if it weren't for this Postal Accountability Act, the USPS financially would be fine because they're self-funded. I mean, when you buy a stamp, you're funding the post office. And we forget that. And we act like it's one, or some people act like it's one of those services that's like a huge burden on the country when it's actually just completely the opposite. And frankly, even if it was a burden, that would be fine because people need to get the mail and people need to vote by mail, like you said. And now more than ever, voting by mail has to become something that we're talking about more. I know I voted by mail for the primary tomorrow. And so, yeah, I think even if it's like not sexy, we got to care about the post office.
Yeah. And again, I think you're right to highlight how popular it is. It's cross-partisan lines. And, you know, especially it's very important. It's even more vital in rural America, which is where we know, you know, the left honestly needs to expand its support in. And I think, you know, one thing, especially since the pandemic, that's really been just troubling me, and you're seeing it over and over. It's just like how easily both the right wing and I think to a large degree liberal media outlets, how easily they play the culture war, and like we get sucked in so easily. And time and time again, we just keep getting divided over different issues, and like it's very easy for them to play this culture war. And I think finding issues such as saving the Postal Service, which are broadly popular and are really tied to workers, you know, higher living standards, higher living wages, is really important that we find these kind of battles to fight. I got to shout out the Philly DSA comrades in the comments. Every stay-at-home lecture, they're by far the best comments. And maybe, I know before talking about like some campaigns, what people can do to help save the post office. I know we are going to get to questions formally, but one that came up that we didn't cover, which we should, is, you know, what kind of services, how can we expand the post office to cover more types of services? Do you want to start with that one, Mindy?
No, Paul, you go. I know you've written a lot about this, so I mean, postal banking, obviously, but
right. Yeah, and one thing to realize is that the postal unions, you know, they're asking for additional funding for what they call modernization, and what they're saying is that, you know, they want to provide more services. They want to upgrade their functioning, but of course you need money to do it. So postal banking, I think, is one of the most famous ones, which would allow basic banking services to be provided in any post office in the country. And I think, you know, this is another thing we can even look at as an anti-racist demand, because payday loans, payday checks, loan sharks, like, you know, they're largely preying on communities of color. And if you can do basic banking in a post office, you eliminate this predatory industry. And it's also another way to both expand employment, living wage employment, and generate more revenue very easily for the post office. So they want to do that. They also want to expand their digital services. They have nothing against doing that, but again, they need money to do it. They want to electrify the postal vehicles. They want to offer electric vehicle charging stations at post offices. So there are so many things that could be done if they were giving the money and resources to do it to help them modernize. But they're kind of being shackled in doing things a certain way. So what about, Mindy, what can we do right now to help the post office? I know you're part of launching a campaign in DSA nationally. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot we can do to help save the post office. So DSA members, the DSLC, which I'm on the steering committee of, and Paul used to be on the steering committee of, launched a campaign to have DSA members try to help USPS and support USPS. And so the first part of that campaign is just sending postcards to our senators and representative in Congress. And so we've had over 6,000 postcards have already been bought, which is awesome. So we did a bulk order. So if you're watching this and you want to order, we might have a second one. I'm not sure yet, but we've already got 6,000 ordered, and they will be sent to the people who ordered them soon, and then they'll be sent to Congress, and that's awesome. And then Paul was mentioning the new Postmaster General, who is a real asshole, and he gets sworn in on June 15th. And so the next day, on June 16th, there are going to be, I know in DC, unions and supporters are going to do a car caravan and some kind of demonstration to, make our voices heard about the new Postmaster General, but also about how we need to save the Postal Service. And so if you're watching this and you're thinking about what you can do, we're going to be doing something in Philly. We haven't gotten all of the plans together, but we're definitely going to be doing something. And you can do something where you live very easily. Go to a post office, make a little sign, get a few of your friends, and call the press. And it really does make a big difference and show the momentum, and shows that, in big cities and small towns, everyone depends on and loves the Postal Service.
Thanks, Mindy. And another event we had done in Philly, which I think, other DSA chapters are doing, and you can do it. You don't have to be in DSA to be doing this stuff. We did a virtual call-in day. And what that was, we worked with the president of APW Local 89 in Philadelphia. And basically, we had a script for calling our senators around pressuring them to, vote for funding for the post office to remain functional. You can get on a Zoom call. We kind of talked through the script. People went on mute when we made the calls, and we came back and debriefed. And especially now that they are back in session, it's really important to highlight, really pressure the Congress people on this. And there, if you go to the Postal Workers Union website, I think you can find, like numbers of national Congress people and your local Congress people, and, what to say to advocate for the post office. Anything else, Mindy, on what people can do?
Sorry, the chat's really distracting me. But no, that sounds right. I think making calls, and honestly getting everyone to make calls, they're so easy. They take 1 second. Their literal job is to listen to you talk. It's not awkward or scary. I think we just really need to again, it's not sexy to call your Congress people, but it's just it needs to be done. So we just all need to be doing it and getting everyone we know to be doing it too.
Mm-hmm. And you can also reach out. There's a group, Communities and for Postal Workers United, and they're kind of like a community support group. And I know they are mobilizing for June 16th, which is this National Day of Action. So if you go to their website, you can find different local contacts of that group to help start coordinating this. So I think we can move to Q&A. So make sure you're putting them in the chat. And I think Kale might come on to help with some of these questions. I did collect 2 that we can maybe start with. So the first one is why is it that the huge volume of online purchases that has increased through the pandemic hasn't translated into revenue for the USPS? Do you want to take that, Mindy, or?
I mean, wait, I'm sorry. Which question was this? I'm sorry. I was reading the chat and getting distracted.
It's
why.
just, there's been an increase in online, and why isn't that translating to increasing revenue?
Well, my understanding, and I might be totally wrong, is just that they're losing mail in other ways is one, and two is that they're competing with all of the other package delivery services, especially Amazon's own delivery service, which pays peanuts, as we know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, what I've heard from the APW union president, Mark Dimmonstein, is that, this a lot of business, I guess we kind of don't think about it, but like they daily will send out ads through the mail. Restaurants, whatever you can think of, that's like a daily thing. And so with so many of them closing down or not really functioning, that is really responsible for a lot of the dip in mail volume. So, online ordering is just not going to make up that. And again, they were already in a precarious situation with having to pre-fund pensions. So this just kind of like really accelerated that. There's another question. What can Amazon workers learn from this history of the USPS?
I don't want to be a downer. So maybe, Paul, you can be like the good cop to my bad cop. I just think it's a really different situation. And I totally agree. We need to organize Amazon, but the undertaking is so huge. Jeff Bezos he is the richest man in the world. That gives him so much power. He's such a bad boss. The turnover at Amazon is over 100%. It's just really hard to organize in those conditions, especially when in a lot of situations you can't actually talk on the floor because you're being constantly surveilled. So I honestly don't think there's anything Amazon workers could learn specifically from USPS. Like, it's really just the larger labor movement. I think you gotta withhold your labor in really, really big groups. But getting to that point, I think, is obviously really, really, really difficult. So I don't know, Paul, if you have anything else.
Yeah, I'll also be bad cop. One thing I'll add is also it's just a slightly different legal situation with it being private sector versus the federal sector. So yeah, I don't know how much can be really directly translated from that, unfortunately. So sorry, Kale, I might call you back on. Those are the two questions I collected. I don't know if there's any more and that you've seen.
Yeah, so we're going to do a couple more questions. I wanted to, before we get to that, just plug your articles, because I know that neither of you wanted to plug your own article. But they've both written really incredible pieces in Jacobin on this topic. Mindy wrote, "The Post Office is a National Treasure. We can't let the privatizers destroy it," and that came out more recently. And then Paul wrote back in 2019, "Defend the Post Office, Defend Black Workers." Both very similar to what they've been talking about tonight, but well worth reading. And I also want to mention that on Wednesday, we're going to have Jonah Birch on to discuss the history of social democracy and give an overview of its contradictions that lead us on the left to fight for something beyond social democracy. On Friday, we're going to have a panel discussion on the legacy of Corbinism, and that features David Broder, John Baptiste Ador, Grace Blakely, and it's going to be moderated by Amber Lee Frost. So just wanted to do those quick plugs. But yeah, we have more questions. First thing I wanted to get into, though, as I'm sure both of you are aware, the APWU came out for Bernie pretty strong. I think it was actually like in the lead up to Iowa. I remember myself and others who were in Iowa knocking on doors. It was a really good kind of boost of enthusiasm for us, kind of trudging through the snow. And so I was wondering if you could talk about kind of what led up to that decision, any of the kind of internal dynamics that allowed or led to the union endorsing Bernie. Is it a more left union than other unions? Is that, or I guess, they endorsed Bernie, but how can we explain why that happened?
I can start with that one, and I'm definitely no expert on all the internal dynamics. So one thing I can say is that Mark Dimmonstein, the current president, he was elected I believe in 2010 or 2012 as kind of a reformer in the union. And I know he individually, he kind of has a long history. For example, he engaged with the Labor Party effort in the 1990s. So I know him as an individual, he has much more of a leftist ideology, and the leadership since his leadership since he's been elected has been trying to kind of revive the union and especially politically take bolder stances. One of their big victories was a few years ago was this Stop Staples campaign, where they were having jobs outsourced to Staples. So like they were trying to make this statement on privatization. So it seems to me that they are further left than many unions. And I think a lot of that is from just Dickinson himself and what he's pushing. And they were also a big advocate of Bernie back in 2015, 2016. And especially, because Bernie, the first time I heard about postal banking was from Bernie Sanders in 2016. So I think he helped make that demand more popular.
And then I'll just also add, I mean, if you think about the strike in 1970 versus bargaining in 1984, I mean, you can see how much the political climate affects bargaining and wages and just how strong workers can be in the workplace. And you would think that all unions would think about that and make decisions like APWU did and endorse like the labor candidate, but for whatever reason they don't. But I think, you can see the writings on the wall for the Postal Service if things don't change. And I think APWU saw that and saw a true ally in Bernie.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We have there's another question from Scott in the chat, and part of his question's already been answered when you guys were talking about postal banking. I think he wanted first just like a kind of the definition of like, what does that actually mean? What would that entail? What are the logistics of bringing banking into the postal system? But then also kind of what other services could be provided. Again, you've touched on this a bit. And then also, what is the history of providing other services in the post office? Is there a precedent that this could follow?
So in terms of connection with the New Deal, I don't think there's so much a precedent of necessarily like these other services. But one of the famous projects of the New Deal, it was more giving artists work of painting these beautiful murals in post offices, which a lot of them still exist today. But I think the ideas they're putting forward now are very solid. Like, the ones I mentioned. So not just postal banking, but the electrifying postal vehicles, which I think many people would get behind. Having almost like postal centers as a hubs for different things, such as electric charging stations and things like that. So I think that's the way they can kind of incorporate this stuff. I already forget the second part of the question. But Mindy, I don't know if anything to add.
No, I also forget the second part. No, I think just to what you said about postal offices as hubs, I think that's like a real possibility in the future, like especially in rural places, thinking about the Postal Service as like the community center. Like it can be the hub of that, and it can be built off of other government services, like a healthcare center when we have Medicare for all, a child care center when we have universal child care, and keeping all of these public services in one place.
And since you mentioned the New Deal, just as another example of what the privatization efforts that are happening now, even the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is one of the famous achievements of like federal jobs program, they are looking to privatize that or at least outsource workers from that who are unionized. And the union is trying to oppose that. But this just shows the danger. They're already moving through with that. We could come out the other end of this crisis with the post office being destroyed and privatized also. So I just wanted to just highlight that it's already happening in other places.
So it looks like we've covered most of the questions, I think. There
was one I saw I might want to address. sorry to cut you off, but there was one
Okay.
just about why shouldn't the USPS be run as a business? What are some good arguments for that? You want to start, Mindy? No? Okay. So, I mean, it's a service, so it's not run for profit. And so, basically, when you make it in a business model, so that going to mean that, where it's not profitable to deliver, like poor areas and rural areas, they're not going to get deliveries. And I think this is highlighted. It's even more important now with people are depending on crucial medicine that comes through the mail, through the post office. They deliver a lot of medicines that way. So, once you make it that way, then you're going to be paying higher rates to ship stuff through the mail. A lot of people aren't going to be getting the services that they need. And again, the whole history, I mean, the post office has been around since before the Constitution. So the whole history has shown that the post office can exist and function for a very long time. There's no reason to privatize it. And again, the one reason there's been faltering has been the fact that they have to pre-fund pensions, which is clearly a ploy to privatize it. Anything to add, Mindy? Or I got it?
No, that's right. I mean, privatizing it really means getting rid of 500,000 union jobs. And, it's partly about money, obviously, but it's also about control of the workforce. When you are in a union, you can bargain with your employer for your wages and benefits and conditions of your work. And when you're not in a union, it sometimes looks like Amazon. And that's what mail and package delivery could look like if the Postal Service is privatized. And that would be really bad. Yeah.
And I saw, Mindy, your mom just put in, they deliver medication for the VA, for example. So that's just, one example of what could be lost, running on the business model.
Well, and totally. And someone else asked about rural America earlier in the chat. And the way the USPS is run now, I mean, really every single person in this country gets mail, and they use snow blowers and fucking donkeys to get the mail to people. And do you think that if Amazon takes over the post office, they're going to use a donkey to get to people who live in the Grand Canyon? No, they're not. And that means some people are not going to get their mail. And I think some people who are young and live in cities are well, I pay all my bills online anyway. But really, millions and millions of people get prescription drugs in the mail who are disabled, who are seniors, who are homebound, who can't. That's their only way of getting their medication. I mean, this would be a crisis for people who can't just walk out their door and they have a pharmacy on their block. And they can't just pay their bills online because they don't have internet or they don't have a computer. And so I think really understanding that this isn't just about sending a letter to your friend, which I love to do and we should all do. This is really about keeping people alive and healthy.
And one other thing I'll add, I forgot to say earlier, I mean, I think in terms of how to start moving on pilot, getting these programs off the ground. So, I mean, one example, New York City, before the election and COVID, they were working on a campaign to pressure the Postmaster General there to pilot a program of postal banking so they could try it out and prove that it can be successful and expand from there. And I know, and so I'm in DSA. I partly have my DSA hat on right now. And again, I know not everyone watching is in DSA, but
they should be. Join DSA. Grow up and join DSA.
Thank you, Mindy. And the point is that that DSA chapter worked with the union on trying to push this program. And I think people should be thinking about that locally. And I think even right now, if locally you can start collaborate local postal unions, you should be thinking towards the future. Hopefully after COVID, when we still have a post office and things are a little bit more normal, try to partner with those unions on pressuring locally to get postal banking piloted. And so we had a brief conversation with the local APW president in Philadelphia when we did our virtual call-in, and they said they would really like that idea. So of course, right now we got to get past the crisis, but going forward, I think there's a lot of opportunities for leftists of all stripes to work in partnership with unions to get pilot postal banking programs. So it's something to keep an eye out for.
Absolutely. Such a great idea. There's one more question in the chat about multiple postal workers unions at a single location, which I can explain. And Paul, I'm curious to hear what you think about this. And then I think we can wrap up. I mean, my mom, who is writing in the chat, she is a rural letter carrier, but her post office also has city carriers. So city carriers and rural carriers are in different unions, and then clerks are in their own union. I think Paul just left accidentally, I'm sure. But so all 3 or sometimes even 4 unions can be in one place. And so that means like they have different clocking out systems, for example. City carriers wear uniforms, rural carriers don't. And so this is common because these unions represent different workers. But I personally, and I'd like to hear what Paul thinks. I don't know where he is, but I'd like to hear what he thinks. Hi, Paul.
I'm sorry, I got kicked off real quick.
That's okay. I was just saying that there are many postal workers unions in a single post office, and I personally think that postal workers would be stronger if they were in a single union together. I'm curious to hear what you think, Paul.
Yeah, and because they were built kind of on a craft union basis, and I think this is another thing that kind of indicates Mark Dimmonson, the APW president, kind of how he might be a little bit more visionary. He's actually been calling for years for there to be one postal union, because you kind of get in different, you might get in different jurisdictional battles, and like each set of workers kind of may have a slightly different contract, and I think it's just better practice to be in a single union. And it's sort of like, some nursing unions now, when they're organizing hospitals, they call it wall-to-wall organizing, meaning all workers in the hospital are in the same bargaining unit. You're not going to like split them up in different ways. I think just from a simple point, like we know, the broader the solidarity, the more numbers, the better. So I think that would be a better route for them to go.
Totally. Stronger together is not just a slogan.
Right.
It's real.
So I'm not sure that might be it for the question. There was one funny question about what's the craziest thing we've gotten in the mail. Maybe we can end on that one.
Weed, honestly.
You can do that. I don't know.
I mean, you can't do that. You can't legally, but yeah. One time I sent my brother a chocolate bar in the mail when we were like kids, and my dog ate it. So. Oh,
there you go. I have only boring stories. I will say I went on the USPS store and I ordered a framed Marvin Gaye stamp. So I did my part to support the Postal Service. There's a lot of interesting stuff on the website.
That's a good point. Everyone should go to the USPS store after this is over in like 1 minute, because they sell the weirdest, most amazing stuff. You can get clothes, toys. They have it all. Book bags.
Who would have thought? Would have never known that. But all right, I think we can wrap up. So remember, people, please hit like and subscribe. Thanks so much, Mindy, for doing this with me. I hope people enjoyed it, and I hope everyone, again, do what you can to support the Postal Service. Mindy, you have any final words?
No, thank you so much for having me. This was great. Go USPS. My mom said she has delivered marijuana. Mom, how do you know? I guess you have to wait for that.
To be continued. Part 2. Part 2. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.